they were thinking of doing another boot camp. And I said to them, I was like, look, when I got my first software engineering role, I didn't have any real experience writing production level code. I didn't have a degree. But what I did have was if you showed up to the office and everything had disappeared, your desk isn't there, your colleagues are nowhere to be seen. When you ask the receptionist, oh, what's happened? They say, oh, everything's moved to India. You'd probably be quite confused. Well, what's even more confusing is that this isn't a hypothetical. This is actually happening to developers. And while they may actually get an email giving them a couple of months advance so they don't show up to an empty office, that doesn't make it any less terrifying. More and more jobs are getting outsourced. And whether you're seeing it on the news or, like me, one of the people that I mentor had lost their role, which is why they reached out, or even some of my close friends. In fact, somebody I live with actually had this happen to them. It is cheaper to get work in certain countries, and businesses are seeing that as an opportunity to just close up shop and outsource. But it's not like there's nothing you can do about it, so let's talk strategy. Well, for a start, it's going to differ depending on whether you're on-site, hybrid, or fully remote. And to understand why, we have to look at what's actually causing jobs to teleport to India and places like it. I think there's this bad attitude, and I kind of spoke about this in the previous video where I talked about AI, that, oh, AI is not actually that good, it could never take our job, or any component of it. And that's kind of the point. AI hasn't really taken people's jobs, but what it has done is made people more productive so that people leveraging those tools can produce more, which might make more people redundant. And people seem to have a similar opinion about being outsourced to countries where work is cheaper. They assume that because the work is cheaper, the quality must be so much worse. Sure, there's going to be certain sacrifices, like for example, if you work for a robotics company and you outsource for software engineering to a country where they don't have access to the robotics, that's not going to make a lot of sense. You've probably got a bit more job security than somebody who's just making a pure website where, in reality, does that need to be made in the country that you're working in? And like it or not, these cheaper countries do have very good talent. Countries can see that there's only this opportunity of, wow, you can make an American income, which the country can tax, by working fully remote. So they're investing in the infrastructure to train people, and they have been since programming and dev jobs took off, which we've got to bear in mind has been decades now, not just a couple of years. Those decades have allowed these countries to catch up, and they're putting out good developers. And since COVID, most companies now have the infrastructure to support remote work, so why wouldn't they start looking all around the world? So first, let's talk about hybrid and on-site roles. Well, like I said earlier, if you're working for a robotics company or some kind of company that requires physical interaction, the cost to move and uproot everything and move it somewhere completely new is going to be pretty huge, and for a lot of companies that's just not feasible. So you can have a little bit more confidence that your job's probably not going anywhere. And that's not true of only the hardware that you have, but also if you're working in a role where you have to deal with other departments and participate in what's called cross-disciplinary work, which is essentially, okay, I'm a software engineer, but I'm working for a loans company. Typically, those kinds of companies will have on-site people who are familiar with finance, and then you're able to communicate with them, oh, by the way, am I implementing this correctly? They respond, yeah. For example, I work in biotech, so at my company, we actually have scientists on site dealing with lab work, and if I'm implementing a solution, I might not necessarily understand the biology behind it because I'm not a biologist. So by having scientists there, I'm able to work with them to make sure that the solution is what the business is intending. It's just these kinds of things that are building layers of friction so that a company is less likely to be able to pull that trigger on, okay, let's just uproot and move somewhere cheaper. It might also be that while, yes, sure, certain countries are mass developing software engineers so that they can cash in on this remote work, that doesn't necessarily mean that every industry is doing that. So, for example, the UK, you have certain tech hubs, like take Cambridge, for example, where a lot of scientists are because there's just work for scientists. You probably can't find those workers just anywhere. And then lastly, are you in something client-facing? Now, I think a lot of people associate all software roles to be, you're always behind a computer, you never have to deal with a customer. But actually, I know for a fact that in a lot of automation industry, especially in science automation, just speaking from experience, but the automation engineer goes on site. They're not exactly building the robotics or designing the robotics, but they are writing the code that allows them to interact with laboratories. There's an expectation that that person goes to the place. So if your company serves in the UK and America, it probably benefits for you to be in the UK or America. But then what if you're fully remote? You don't exactly have these benefits that you could spec into to make sure that you've got some form of job security. Well, what I'd say is don't be thinking about job insecurity, be thinking about opportunity. The fact that the company is able to outsource itself to a different country is precisely the thing that's going to give you an advantage. You shouldn't care that they're disappearing because you're able to cash in on the same thing that they're cashing in on. Global option. Where maybe once upon a time, say if you're not living in the more affluent parts of America or England or outside of those countries, well, it would have been very difficult to get a high-paying job. You would have had to have moved to the location. I don't live inside of London. I live outside of London. And yet a lot of my friends that live in the same area as me have remote jobs for the city. So they're on a city wage, but they're paying non-city prices. And that's just nationally. We all know that there are websites that serve global jobs. It's just that we need to actually start applying to them. And I've made this point before. If your company's lifting up and trying to downsize or outsource to cut corners, are they the same kind of company that would be trying to nurture career and give you promotions? Definitely not. So just see it as, okay, if they are upping roots, it was about time that you left anyway, and it's time to go find a company that is going to pay well and can actually give you the career progression that you're looking for. Now, whether you're in either of these camps, hybrid or remote, there are some simple things that you can do which you're going to have heard of before, but it's more important than usual to be dealing with this because, like I said, jobs are starting to disappear. Right, so one of the things that you hear about the rush that you get in India, China, and even some Eastern Bloc European countries is that just because the governments are pushing towards education on coding doesn't necessarily mean that what you get out of that is good problem solvers. And it's not even like that's an individual thing just to those countries. You'll meet people like that wherever you work. You know, people who understand the academic literature but can't actually put it into practice. The difference between a problem solver and a coder. Companies want problem solvers. I made this point to somebody who left a comment saying that they weren't too sure what could set them apart and how they were thinking of doing another boot camp. And I said to them, I was like, look, when I got my first software engineering role, I didn't have any real experience writing production level code. I didn't have a degree. But what I did have was evidence that I had worked in construction and I had automated elements of my role and saved the company money. Yes, the code probably wasn't great, but the point is that I'd identified problems, off my own back solved them, and then presented them in a coherent way that got them implemented. The company that hired me wasn't necessarily worried about what architecture I used, just the fact that I'd actually gone outside the norm and tried to solve problems that other people were just assuming were the status quo. And you can do that right now at your company. What are those things that you do day in, day out that really could be automated? Share it with your team. Start proving to people that you're noticing problems and you're finding efficiencies. Make sure you're not falling behind. We know how fast the industry is moving. Just look at the rate of AI. I keep talking about it. Are you aware of what tooling there is? Because let's be real, if you haven't looked around in a year, things have changed a lot. Copilot isn't what it was. You've got IDEs like Cursor. Maybe it's finally time to bite the bullet and learn Vim so that you can start producing code far faster than the average software engineer. In fact, if you pick that up, you're not even going to be comparable. You'll be doing things in minutes that will take them half an hour to an hour. And lastly, make sure that you're staying knowledgeable of what the current tech trends are in your area. That's not saying that you need to just go out and, I need to know every single JavaScript framework and what's Microsoft doing at the minute with .NET. But also I need to know what the coolest framework is at the minute for making a mobile app. No, all you need to do is stay in your wheelhouse and make sure that you at least know companies are never at the cutting edge, but you can read a couple of articles and at least have an awareness of what's available. So when it comes around and they say, oh, we've got X, Y, and Z problem, and you're aware that actually it would be worth upgrading because the latest version of your language solves that problem, that's just another advantage in your back pocket. And if you really think that, you're super pigeonholed into one of these positions where it's just bound to get outsourced pretty soon, then also it's not the end of the world. We are currently in a time where you have the most opportunity ever to try and start making money off your own back, whether that's through content creation, creating a SaaS product, doing consultancy work, or your oyster. And in all of those systems, you don't have to rely on a company. You don't have to be thinking, God, what if I lose my job? What if this company doesn't have the finances to increase my income? Because all of those are driven by not some external forces. They're driven by you and the work you're willing to put in. So maybe the wake-up call here for you is, shit, it's time to become self-employed, and then I don't have to worry about these things. And that is literally what I help people with in my mentoring. So again, to turn the narrative on its head, this outsourcing thing isn't a sign of the end times. You shouldn't be thinking, oh God, I can't be a software engineer. It's a sign that actually technology is changing in such a way that there's a lot of opportunity, sure, for some companies, which means that your current job might not exist. But the same was true back when tractors came out and everybody in the farm was like, oh shit, I'm not going to have a job because people are going to be on the tractors. It's like, well, actually, your job on the tractor was way better than being in the farm. Your job being a mechanic for the tractors was way better than being in a farm. Your job selling the tractors was better than being in a farm. So all of the jobs that created, that those people propagated out into, just ended up being better. And that's the perception that we need to have of globalization of software engineering and the power of fully remote work. We're more interconnected and there are more opportunities to build things than ever. And if you're thinking about how do I do that as fast as possible, well, I actually have a video about how you can leverage AI to do it and how there seems to be this exact same trend of, oh, AI is taking jobs. No, it's opportunity. Watch the video. Cheers.